What's up guys, Justin here with the RenderingEssentials.com, back with another Twinmotion tutorial for you. So in today's video we're going to talk about the weather settings and the way that you can use those to simulate different seasons inside of Twinmotion. So let's go ahead and just jump into it. Alright, so we've talked a little bit about the weather settings in some other videos, but I haven't really gone through them in detail, so I wanted to go ahead and give you a video where I talk through these different settings and kind of what they do. Because when you first open up the weather settings inside of your nature settings, they're a little bit weird, and so you kind of have to mess around with them a little bit to figure out exactly what they do. So basically what you have here is you have two different options, or two different sliders. And so the slider at the top is going to affect your clouds in your sky, as well as the precipitation that's falling out of the sky. So like for example, if you click and drag this, you can see how this basically takes you through the sequence. You can almost think of this as being like the sequence that a rainstorm goes through. So like for example, if I was to click and drag this to right here, you're just going to get some clouds in the sky. But they're not that thick, and you can use that to make your sky a little bit more interesting, things like that. However, as you click and drag this, you can see how what happens is as you drag this a little bit further, this is going to simulate blocking the sun, kind of like clouds would do as they get thicker. And then the further you drag this to the right, the more you're going to start blocking the sun, but the more you're also going to start getting some precipitation falling out of the sky. So you can see how if I drag this over this cloud right here, so the one that's got the little lines and X's coming out of it, you can see how you're getting a lot more precipitation in here. And if you zoom in, you can see how what this is doing is this is actually simulating that precipitation falling on different objects inside of your rendering. So like for example, if you look at your ground or your paving, it looks like it's wet and it's covered with water. So lights bouncing off of it and all of that. And if you kind of look off into the distance, you're getting the same kind of effect with the grass off in the distance as well. So you can use this setting in order to create this kind of like shiny look on your different surfaces that you would get if it was raining. And one thing that I thought was kind of interesting is if you look at things like the vehicle, like this one right here, if I was to move this vehicle back, you can see how this is actually blocking the rain from getting on the ground. So Twinmotion is actually simulating the rain being blocked by an object like this car. And so you can use this setting in order to simulate whether or not it's raining and also whether or not it's cloudy. And you can see how there's kind of a setting on the backside that's more like the second half of a rainstorm when the rain's beginning to stop, where the clouds kind of clear up a little bit, but the precipitation is still coming down and you still have a wet look on your ground. And then the further to the right you drag this, the more you're going to get your sun coming out and everything else. But if you go to about right here, you're still getting that kind of precipitation look on the ground. And then if you drag that even further, at a certain point it's sunny again and all of your surfaces show up as dry. So the top one, you can kind of consider that more adjusting the weather, and then the bottom one, if you look at it, that one actually is more like adjusting the seasons. And so you can see how if I click and drag this, where the other one created precipitation in the sky, this one is actually affecting things like the vegetation inside of your rendering. So like for example, if I drag that to right here, you can see how my trees that have this setting are turning orange, kind of like they would in fall when all the leaves start falling and all of that. And one thing to note about that is you can select each one of these trees and you can set which season it is. So you can override this for the different instances of these different trees. So if you leave this on automatic, then those are going to change whenever you change your weather settings. So you can see how as I drag this across the seasons, those are going to change. But if you don't want them to do that, each individual tree or each individual piece of vegetation contained in this library is going to give you the option to either override the season or leave it on automatic so that it'll change when you change the slider. And so if I drag this off to the right even further, at a certain point what happens is I start getting snow on the ground. So you can see how when I drag this to the right, this is simulating snow on most of my surfaces, or at least kind of my ground surfaces. I haven't looked too closely at the building to see what it does. It looks like it does simulate snow up here. It's not necessarily simulating that down here. I'm not sure if that's because that's covered by an object or what, but you can see how this is actually simulating snow on all of these different objects. One thing to note is if you set this to the snow season and then you turn on your precipitation, instead of getting rain, you're going to get snow inside of your image. So you can see how by dragging this here and setting your season to wintertime, you can create a snowy scene inside of Twinmotion really easily. So if I drag this back to the right, it's going to do the same thing. So it's going to do the same thing with the sky and the clouds that it did before, but notice that snow stays here until you change the season to something other than wintertime. So if you change the season to something other than wintertime, like back over here, you can see how you get that wet ground look in here again. And so the other weather setting I want to talk about a little bit is I want to talk a little bit more about the effects off to the right hand side. And so the effects on the right hand side are going to give you some options having to do with your wind and also your smog. So let's take a look at both of those. The first one, if you set the wind speed like this by dragging this up, you can see how your trees and your bushes are actually going to simulate moving in the wind. So if you turn your wind speed up, then you can simulate the wind blowing and things like that. Now I will note, you can also adjust the direction that wind is blowing. I will note that this doesn't seem to affect the precipitation and the way that that's coming down. So like for example, if I was to turn my wind speed up like this, you'll notice that my precipitation isn't getting blown to the side or anything like that. That's still coming in straight up and down, which I don't think is a huge deal, but it is just something to be aware of. You know, if you're going to simulate really heavy wind, just know that it might look a little bit odd, only because your rain is just going to fall like normal. But it's definitely a cool feature to have, and like I said, you can also adjust the direction that the wind comes from. And so the other setting I want to take a look at really quick is the smog. And so the smog does a couple different things. So the first thing it does is if I was to fly up and you look in the background, you can see I have the background image right here. Well, if I click on this and I click and drag the smog up, what that's going to do is that's going to add more particles in the air. So it's kind of going to scatter light in here. So the more you drag that up, the less light's going to travel and the less far you can see. And you can see how that gives you kind of a foggy look here as well. So I almost wish they called this fog instead of smog, because you can use this for fog as well as this smogginess so that you don't have to see in detail this background image. But what I want to point out is if you go into your weather and you have like a rainy day or something like that, you can add a fair amount of realism to this by running that smog amount up, because what that'll do is that'll simulate the moisture in the air. So if I drag this up, you can see how that kind of simulates that wet moisture in the air look that you get inside of a rainstorm. So as you're simulating things like rainstorms, you can consider running that value up a little bit, so that you can get a little bit more of a realistic water vapor feel inside of your renderings. And so that's kind of these settings. The other thing I want to point out is when you actually go in to render this image, you set this for each image by going into the media section and clicking on image, and then inside your image that you create, your precipitation settings are getting saved inside of that image. So like for example, this image got created with that precipitation in here, but I would go inside my more section and set the weather itself for each individual image by coming in here. So like for example, if I was to go back and look at this image, you can see how this one doesn't have any precipitation or anything like that. If I wanted to add that to this image, I just go to weather, and then I'd adjust that actually inside this image. So you can store different weather settings inside individual images just like this. So, and then once you do this, you can either render a video with the precipitation going, or you can also render a still image just by setting this, just by setting up the view the way that you want it. And then once this is set up, you can go into your export settings and just export an image, just like we do a normal image, and just export that. And so if you open that image up, you can see how this will render all of these different rain particles inside of the sky falling down. And then it's also got little droplets in here from whatever time you had selected where you rendered that image. So one thing you might want to think about if you find these distracting or something like that is you might want to think about taking this setting and adjusting it. So like this. So maybe adjusting that by finding this setting over here where you've got all that on the ground, but the actual precipitation isn't really falling. So it's not in there kind of changing the way that your image looks. So if you wanted to do that, you could just render this again. So you can see how this one will give you that wet pavement look without actually having all of the particles actually in this image. So that's where I'm going to end this video. Leave a comment below and let me know what you thought. Was this helpful to you? Have you been able to get good results with the weather settings in Twinmotion? I just love having that conversation with you guys. If you liked this video, please remember to click that like button down below. If you're new around here, remember to click that subscribe button for new rendering content every week. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I really appreciate it, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.